Good morning and welcome to the Level Set. Today I'm your host, Dr. Charles L. Alexander, St. Louis, Missouri, by way of Homewood, Illinois, which is a southern suburb of Chicago, and being joined by attorney Larry Fields in St. Louis. How are you today, Attorney Fields?
I am well, Dr. Alexander. I'm hanging in there as best we can. As we discussed pre-production, on my way to a homegoing service of one of University City's heroes, another one. Nelly's not the only one. Just to let everyone know, there are quite a few city heroes at University City High. And Arthur Jemison is the gentleman that we're honoring this morning because he's run his race and he's at home already, but we're doing some ceremonial things that we do to make his physical absence more palatable.
Got it. And so in light of that, that's going to be the bulk of our conversation today, and that is how we deal with these losses, and also, just as you referenced, some of the ceremonial aspects and how those things have taken shape, over the course of our time in this experiment called America. So, we'll work backwards, and in part because we also had another issue close, to our program family, and with the tragedy that has touched Attorney Gerald Christmas's family. Can you speak on that?
Yes, I can to some extent. Gerald's brother was murdered on Sunday at one of these gas stations here. Details are still coming in. Gerald won't be with us today. He's traveling abroad. But it was an untimely, senseless, tragic extraction of someone that should be here. And there's blame to go around in that one. So, that one is not going to be easy to digest nor decode because, there are things that are ongoing and I don't want to speak to them because number one, I don't know all the facts. But number two, it is, I would rather Gerald speak on those at the proper time. But the most important thing, as you brought out, is that it happened to a family member, and we are all flying our flags at half staff and trying to begin the process of grief, which is very, very difficult in any situation, but it is exacerbated when it's a sibling.
Correct. And so with that, have a conversation about grief. So there's a couple of things in this space from a psychological perspective to give thought to consider. So we have grief and we have bereavement, and one of the things that I don't know if I'm seeing it more, I just know that I see it more than I like to see it, and that is there's a growing, again, as I said, I don't know if it's more, but I'm very aware, let's say that, not gonna say growing. I'm very aware of this the challenge with grief and bereavement, right? So grief is that feeling that you experience as the result of a loss. Now that loss doesn't have to be death. That loss is loss, period. It could be separation, um, um, like you just, well, and that separation can be from anywhere. Like any kind of parting can lead to grief. If you move from, a house that, let's say you move from the house that you were born in, that can be a separation that causes grief. Or if you leave your old neighborhood, that could be a separation that causes grief. If you actually have a marital separation, or if you just break up in a relationship, that can cause grief. And similarly, if we have a death of a loved one, that loss could cause grief. So any type of loss and separation can cause grief. So that's baseline. We have to understand that. Now, in the case of death, we may have another extended period, and that's called bereavement. And bereavement is that time of grief that is associated kind of specifically with the grief that comes from the loss of a loved one. And but what I've seen in that space is that, like, so there used to be like kind of a construct in terms of bereavement. And so if I think it was believed, like, 6 months, you were granted 6 months of bereavement, and if you were experiencing mood symptoms subsequent to that 6 months, then you might have complex bereavement. And then if it persists beyond that, then you may be looking at depression, secondary to the loss. But I think that we're moving beyond that, and really being able to appreciate that people grieve at the pace at which they grieve. And then we can certainly talk about the difference between depression and bereavement. But what I want people to know is that the fact that there is grief and or bereavement doesn't mean that you are struggling. That in and of itself doesn't mean that you're struggling with the loss, and that there is any major alarm or need to respond differently. You should grieve, and you should have a period of bereavement.
Let me remind those that have listened to us in the past, and those that are listening to us for the first time, that Dr. Alexander is a clinical psychologist, that he's not coming up with these terms out of thin air. These are things that he studied. And as I'm listening to you, I am reminded of how important the vocabulary is for just the ability to analyze what one is going through. And what I'm hearing you say is unlike what's typically stated in our community traditionally, is that, chin up, you got to move on. You've had X number of months to deal with this, and that, and that there is no standard grieving nor bereavement period in these situations.
Correct. And I think another thing that also gets confused is that somewhere along the way, people started to adopt the notion that at some point you're not going to miss the loss. You're not going to miss the person that we lost. And so that can get confusing. And so it's like, I think about him, on his birthday every year, and every time I do this, I think about, well, that's what you're supposed to do. Is a loved one. But that can be confusing from some folks who really believe that there's this fixed amount of time for you to mourn, and then after that, you're supposed to turn the page. And but that's not true. You miss the people until you don't. And the fact of the matter is, you don't have to not miss them. The issue is, and how we start to distinguish between grief and bereavement and a more significant mood disturbance, either be it anxiety or depression or some combination thereof, is that are your daily life activities interrupted, right? Are we getting to a point where you absolutely can't concentrate and function? Are we getting to a point where your self-care is not being maintained? Are we given to a point where like you're just literally crying uncontrollably? There has to be some actual impairment in your functioning in order for the grief and or bereavement to to kind of transition or develop into the depression. And again, even in the situation where it transitions to depression, to the extent that we have a pretty clear onset in terms of the trauma that has resulted in the depression, that in and of itself isn't a problem. The problem then becomes, do we have access to care, right? And can we be accepting? So two things: are we accepting of the fact that this is what's going on with us? And then B, do we have access to care?
Doc, what are some of the suggestions you have on how to deal with this whole piece in the first place with respect to grief? I mean, what are some of the things that you should be doing that you recommend that one does when they're dealing with the loss of a loved one, and specifically in this?
So answer that in the context of, so there's a construct that that is used that people find helpful. It's called the 5 stages of grief, and it was put together allegedly by this clinician named Dr. Kubler-Ross. And I say allegedly because in some of my other readings and some things that I've listened to in this space kind of speak of this construct as also another example of cultural appropriation. And so we'll get to that part of it secondarily. But essentially, she posits that there are 5 stages of grief. Okay, so first thing that happens when we have this loss is denial, right? So, a person may, the first thing that the person might do to try to cope with the situation is to deny the situation is occurring, or deny the significance of the situation, right? And so my initial response to your question is actually the last stage of this process, and it is actually acceptance. So in this construct, we start with
you broke up, Doc. What was the last stage?
So let me say all of the stages first, and then we'll go through. So the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I, I think that our first piece is, and this is kind of consistent with our conversation in the past couple of weeks in terms of like reality testing, and that, the first thing is to accept that the event has occurred, that the loss has occurred. We have to start there, that this is what has occurred. And because in that space, you can do what is necessary to take care of yourself. So if you're denying that it has even occurred, then it's very difficult for you to engage in self-care. And so the first thing to do in these types of situations is to, literally acknowledge the loss. And it could take, it certainly can take however long it takes. That's kind of what we're, speaking in terms of your ultimate your ultimate acceptance, meaning that you've transitioned through your grief and your bereavement, and now you've pivoted and you're going on. Yes, that full acceptance piece can take a little longer because you do have to grieve. But there has to be a level of acceptance in order for you to even engage the grief process. And so in order to engage the grief process, you have to you have to accept the loss on the front end, and you have to engage in self-care. And when I say self-care, I mean just the fundamental, making sure you're getting your rest, making sure that you're eating. And in these moments, that's, again, we're probably gonna have a sympathetic nervous system response. This is an external threat. This is a phenomenological threat. That's what death is. And so it's not surprising that your system might be moving in such a way to deal with some perceived form of threat. So you might not have an appetite because your mind and body, they're preparing to deal with this threat. So those things, your digestive tract is not necessarily a primary issue at that time. And so all of the energies and the things that deal with, kind of making you making you hungry and, needing to satisfy that, those things are secondary. And so that's, in stressful situations, that's why sometimes people don't eat. And so even if you don't have an appetite, you should eat healthier, just less things. So just to make sure that you're getting some nutrients, so some fruits, some vegetables, things of that nature, drink water, You have to be taking care of yourself. You might not be able to sleep, but you can still rest. So even if you're not, if you're not getting good sleep initially, you still got to lay down. You still got to turn out the lights. You still got to allow your mind and your body to rest. You have to do those things. And so, and it's the same. I think one of the places where we get stuck at is that in situations of death, we break that rule that we get when we get on the airline, when we get on the plane, and they say, if we need these oxygen.
Wait a minute. That's my favorite part of buying a ticket. I love to take the whole family, but go ahead, Doc. I see where you're going. Go ahead.
That oxygen mask drops, and they say,
That's right.
You got to breathe first, and then you help.
You put yours on first, don't you?
You put yours on first.
That's right.
And what happens when we are in situations, we don't get to grieve because well, I gotta be strong
Right.
for everybody else, right? No,
Come
you
on,
gotta
man.
breathe for you.
Right. Right. And I'm also hearing you say that it's mandatory that you go to the repast, and even a vegan has to get 1.5 fried wings from the repast.
Even a vegan. So
Even a vegan, even a
so
vegan has to get 1.5 fried. That's the rule when we're
those are the
grieving.
rules.
Even a
Those are
vegan has to get 1.5 fried wings at the repast. Okay. All right, Doc.
so
That
we
is
got
that
to take
is
care of ourselves.
awesome. Keep going, man.
Yeah, gotta take care. You gotta put your mask on first, right? And then once you do
Right.
that, then you can, kind of pivot and help to take care of everybody else. Hopefully, we are not alone. But what we also know is that the older we get, actually, the more likely it is that we have fewer, that we could be alone. That's kind of how that works. But hopefully, we're connected and we have a community, we have a network, and so that there can be a delegation of responsibility, and there are other folks who are available, who are pouring into you to help you out. And so but this is a reason why it is good to have affiliations. This is why it's good to have a church or a mosque community or a synagogue community, that you have social connections. It's good to have a neighborhood block club. It's good to be in a fraternity or a sorority. It's good to be in organizations, so that you have connections, you have social connections and social supports for moments just like this, right? And so back to the 5 stages. So first, a person goes through denial, and so they're not accepting of what's going on, and and they may even be avoiding it, but you can't avoid it. And the longer that you don't accept that basic thing, that the loss has occurred, the longer it takes for you to actually get into the grieving process. And it's those types of things. It's that struggle on the front end that can really make you susceptible to the transition um, from grief, bereavement, to like a mood disturbance, right? And so then a person can go from the denial to the anger, right? Um, and I mean, and we've seen this, but you could be angry and accepting, right? We don't want the loss. That's not what we want. Now, sometimes when we don't want the loss, it's kind of selfish, right? Now, like when we have loved ones who literally aren't well, and the quality of life has deteriorated to such a degree that for them to be here is really worse for them, and them being here is really for the living, right? And so so sometimes people end up in those spaces where they can be bitter about the loss, and da 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 da. And then other times when there's a tragic unexpected loss, and a tragic, a loss that just doesn't make sense, as we were referring to Attorney Christmas's brother. That's a senseless tragedy, right? You could be angry in those situations. And so it's not a problem really with being angry. It's more an issue about what you're angry about and how you manage the anger. And so, for us, again, it gets kind of tricky when we talk about anger, because, you know, we've been informed by multiple sources, particularly for Black folks, that we are overly emotional or excessively emotional, and then for Black men, we're angry Black men, and then you got angry Black women, and da 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 da. So it can be difficult sometimes for us to express our anger, which subsequently makes it difficult for us to manage our anger because we are ambivalent about the presence of our anger, period. So again, some of it is that we internalize negative stereotypes, and other parts of it is that we misappropriate scripture and we don't think that we're supposed to be angry. But
which is a total misappropriation, because the scripture is very clear about that. Anger should not rest in your bosom, is what it says. It doesn't say you're not supposed to be angry. But it clearly says you don't allow anger to fester overnight. But Doc, with respect to anger, my understanding is that anger is a secondary emotion as it relates to, if that is true, if that is something that we can establish, as it relates to the bereavement, what is the primary, oftentimes, if we could drill that down, what is the primary emotion that is up under the anger that we should be dealing with?
In the context of a loss, it is the loss. So it's the hurt, that comes with the loss or the separation from, the loss of the loved one. Like, in the case of a death, that's what. So that primary piece is purely that sense of loss.
Okay. So I can see that. That makes perfect sense. So it's the actual, I am angry and upset because of the actual absence that I'm feeling, the loss that I'm feeling.
Correct.
Of my loved one. And then we can throw in all sort of woulda, coulda, shouldas. Yep. I should have said I love you more, or I should have, spent more time. I should have bought more things. I should have worked less. All of those things on top of that, essentially amplify that anger.
And I think you just hit it really on the head, in that I think so much of our struggle to get into the grief process are associated with those things that you just noted. All of these other things that kind of come in, because depending on the dynamics of your relationship with the bereaved, then one of the things that can settle in is a level of guilt. And it's those shoulda couldas that you just noted. Did I spend enough time? Did I say the right things? Had I forgiven them? And this is what's really hard for folks who hold those grudges, and I ain't gonna never talk to such and such again. And and we even say something, I'm gonna go to my grave like that. And then as soon as that person passes away, it all sets in, and the person realizes and recognizes, I should have done whatever was necessary to reconcile us. Because now he or she is gone. And now you're sitting there struggling with those, woulda, coulda, shouldas. Right. And so guilt can kind of settle in. And guilt can settle in even when it's not a contentious circumstance. Guilt can just settle in because in hindsight, you just feel like, there's something that you could have done, differently, something that you could have done better. I have a client right now. She's kind of I think it's been about a month since her mother passed, and she was her mother's primary caretaker. And her mother coded. She performed CPR, brought her back. She stabilized her mind long enough for the emergency responders to get to her house. They came, they took her, and they stabilized her. And she was able to live, I think, maybe about a week, and she passed away. So what happens in that week? Well, in that week, because of Sister's ability to perform CPR, and I think we've talked about this before, emergency preparedness is key. So we always have to remember that. Because that sister was able to perform CPR, she brought her mother back. In that period of time, they were able to run tests and do everything to even figure out if, life going forward was an option, and they determined that it wasn't. So then what did that week provide? It provided an opportunity for family to come and see her as she prepared to transition. Right. And so her acts of love and kindness benefited everybody, her mother, and her friends and family, because it provided time that they wouldn't have had she not been able to bring her mother back. And
unless you've lost someone close, I don't think people understand the gift that is. Because my father went suddenly, but my mother had time and told. There was a medicine that my mother was on that was squeezing her heart. But it was causing such excruciating pain. She told me she was going to take it one more time. And she said, I'm taking this for you because you're not ready. And I tell you, the love that was in that, I was able to process her death far better, as close as we were, than I was with my father's, because she gave me that. And it was about a week. She gave me that. That's probably it's not even close. That's the largest gift I've ever been given outside of the gift of life, that God gives me to move my limbs and so forth. And so, I totally understand what that was. And I don't think that we can underscore how big a gift that your client provided her family with that.
And so the thing that I'm helping her work through, because her primary care physician, because this is what happens when you're dealing with someone outside of the culture, it's been a month, and he's telling her, we might need to consider antidepressants. And I was like, no, sister, we don't need to consider antidepressants. You're still grieving. You're still grieving. And so she said, but I cry every day. And I said, okay, but how about your self-care? Well, no, I'm taking care of myself. All right. And so you're eating? Yes. Now she's off work, but she having nothing to do with this. I've been trying to convince her to retire. So I really don't care that she's off work. That's not a function of her not being able to do. She works in a very stressful work environment that I just don't think is in her best interest to work in. And she literally is financially stable. Like, she works because she want to work. She ain't got to work. She ain't never got to work. Her kids ain't got to work. And so, but what has occurred is she's kind of in that space, not because she had a course relationship with her mom, but from time to time, she'll say to me, if I would have initiated CPR sooner. And I'm like, sister, what do you mean? You did it as soon as you recognized it. She said, well, but there was a moment when I couldn't hear my mother moving around, that the time that it took for me to respond to that might have been, a game changer, because I just went in there because I realized, I noticed that over a certain amount of time, she wasn't moving around. When I first noticed it, I should have went. And so she's literally breaking herself over the coals for not walking into the room just a little sooner. And so, but that's a part of
Doc, that is the piece that, I don't know if we even will have time to go over, but there are individuals that blame themselves for the actual passing on of others. And I mean, that's a whole show, I would imagine, Doc.
Yes. And that kind of teeters on, like the next, aspect of the of the process, and it's called bargaining, right? So you got denial, anger, bargaining. So now in bargaining, you're saying, if I'd have did this, then that. Right. So if I would have run in there sooner, then my mom would be here today. Well, we don't know. Right. But what we do know is the more you the worse you feel.
Doc, you froze. Doc, you froze after you said if I would do this, then that.
Okay. So I was talking. So this moves us like what I'm describing with my client in terms of, if I would have went in there sooner, my mom would probably still be here. That's the transition into the bargaining phase. So you have denial, anger, and then bargaining. And so in bargaining, you're literally doing that. You're like, and you might be bargaining, you might just be talking, or you might even be bargaining with God. You fixed in your mind that had you done something differently, this outcome would not have occurred. This would not have been the outcome. Right? Now, some people do, bargain with God. God, if you write this, if you bring him back, I'll never do such and such and such again. So some people bargain like that. Some people bargain like, they're bargaining literally with themselves, trying to reconcile what has occurred. And that, if I'd have moved sooner, if I'd have moved quicker, if I'd have, whatever. It's literally into those woulda, coulda, shouldas, right? But it's not necessarily from a like you didn't do those things necessarily because there was some conflict or there was, some contentious relationship. Like in this case, it had gotten a little quiet in the bathroom. She recognized that it was a little quiet in the bathroom. And the longer it was quiet, the more concerned she became. Then she went and then she found her mom. And then she performed CPR and then she brought her mom back. And so, and I totally appreciate the struggle that she's having. But again, her mom didn't transition because, like, her mom didn't pass out because she didn't come into the bathroom. Her mom passed out. And then she ultimately recognized that her mom passed out. And then she went and brought her back. So that's the part of the process that she's, needing help to figure out what she's, so I call it a sequence analysis. And so we have to go through the steps. So what happened first? Your mom lost consciousness first. It wasn't you didn't respond first, it's that your mom lost consciousness first. And it's as you realize that was going on, that then triggered you to act. And so it's very important that people kind of understand also the kind of the course of things. And so, but that's the bargaining piece. And so you have the denial, and you start to accept that things have occurred at some level, and then you can get into the anger space. Then you get to the bargaining space. Then you get to the depression space, and then you start to feel increasingly sad, disinterest. Then you can have symptoms that look like depression, but they probably aren't depression. They're probably just what happens when you have a significant loss. Now, again, it's okay if they're depression. Again, it's a couple of situations in which it's okay. A, again, it's a major loss. B, if you're a person that had a history, of mood disturbance anyway, then of course a loss like this can, trigger another episode, because that's the other thing we have to know about depression and really all mood disturbances is that they're episodic, meaning they come and go. And so what is important, that I acknowledge that I'm depressed and that I have access to care, that I acknowledge that I'm depressed, that I'm willing to seek care, and I got access to care. That's what's important. That's what's important. And so, but, for most folks, what we're looking at, the overwhelming majority, we're just looking at what it looks like when when you have this kind of loss. And so it's just the grief and the bereavement is not depression. For some people, it gets to the depression. But for most people, it's just that normal process of grief and bereavement. And so
how do I know if it's depression, Doc?
as opposed to the grief and
Yes.
Again, that's where you get, self-care out the window, days on end, you're not eating or sleeping, or you might be eating too much or sleeping too much. You might start, you might start doing things that are uncharacteristically you, or you might do things that are characteristically you in excess. So if you are a person who, has a beer a month, but then in the wake of a loss, you start out doing a 6 in a week, and now you're doing a 6 a day. Now we know there's something wrong, right? Your person you usually have a meal or 2 a day, and now you just find yourself just like binging. So not even like grazing throughout the day, which could be okay, but like you're like literally binging, and like these stark behavioral changes. That's how we start to get a sense. That's how we get it. That's how we should be keying in, and that's how the people around us should be keying in, right? And it's not that I don't want to get out of bed, it's the I'm not getting out of bed, right? And so, so what I think the standard now in the workplace is what you get, like a day and a half, 2 days or something like that for bereavement or something like that, if it's a primary or close relationship.
Right, 3 days maximum, what I've seen.
Yeah, so like you get on the other side, you get to that 4th day, and it's, let's say you go back to work, but you literally can't get it done and you can't concentrate. Mind's wandering, it's plausible that you could be depressed. That's plausible. So in order to get to the stage that we're looking at, like a diagnosable mood disturbance, you have to have impairment, right? And that impairment is either in social relationships, work or school, and just your subjective thing. Now, in my diagnostic practice, I pair, I pair that subjective experience with one of those other outward manifestations. And so, so I deal with yes, I feel sad and I'm tearful all the time. But if you're not telling me that if you feel sad all the time in the wake of this, but you are still functioning, and you're functioning, at the level that you're accustomed to functioning and that everybody else is accustomed to you functioning, then I'm gonna suggest to you that this is just regular bereavement that we're looking at. It's when you're unable to do one of those things, when you're not getting up, when you're not getting out of the bed, when you're not managing your self-care. That's when I start to look at, maybe we're looking at depression. But so much of this is the functional piece, and that's a difficult part of the way that that's the difficult part about the way that our diagnostic system works. But in more cases than not, I think it's appropriate, because the fact that we're uncomfortable, I don't think means that we need to be medicated or that we need time off or da 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 da. That fact in and of itself, I don't think that means. I think we need higher levels of care when that discomfort is accompanied by an inability to take care of ourselves, however that take care of ourselves may look. I can't work. I'm literally not maintaining my self-care. So I'm not bathing, eating, drinking water, or some other appropriate beverage. When I am drinking, I'm drinking alcohol. That's when we got to start looking at things, not just the subjective feeling of depression or loss, but the observable change in functionality. That's where things get to be tricky. And so for most folks, they go through these processes and then they ultimately get to a place of acceptance. Now, acceptance, again, it don't mean that you're good with the fact that you've lost a loved one. It means that you understand and can appreciate the life lived, and that the transition ultimately was inevitable. We are born to die. And so you get to a point where you start to find some measure that the person no longer has to fight this fight, and that they are on the other side, and that you know where they are. They are at peace, right? And so you ultimately get to that point. And you kind of get to that point, however you get to that point. I just think that you have to start with the acceptance. If you don't start with a level of acceptance, you can't get into your grief. So you don't have to have it all reconciled on the front end of it, but you do have to be accepting of the loss, because that's the only way that you get into the grief process. And so that's kind of what it looks like. Now, the other piece that we have to understand, that this is just a construct, and it's a construct that helps to kind of organize your thoughts and can organize your behavior in the context of this type of situation. But this isn't necessarily a stage progression. Like when it was first introduced, and probably for much of its existence, as people have taught it, they've taught it as a stage theory, and in part because the title is 5 stages. But the author's intent was that it's 5 stages, meaning that these are just 5 things that occur. They can occur in any order. It can look like a figure 8. It could be whatever. It's just that, in her conceptualization of things, that people go in and out of these stages as they grieve. And then ultimately you get to a point of acceptance, right?
And I can certainly see them regressing. You can go plausible denial overnight. That ever happened. And there are times where there are things that are going to come up during the course of your life and your loved one's absence that are going to evoke anger, no matter what. How good, how well the life was lived, and sometimes the anger may be self-directed. Sometimes the anger may be at others, I would imagine.
And so, that's where we have to look at, like, in terms of how we manage these things. That's where we have to start to look at our ritual processes in context. This is why we have burials. It's all about facilitating the process of grief and acceptance. And so,
exactly.
And so at the beginning, you were talking about you were going to go and memorialize this brother, that you've lost. That's what the memorialization is about. This is about helping the community to go through the processes of acknowledging the life and accepting the death, accepting the transition. And so it is a ritual process. And for us, it's a ritual process that predates our captivity. It's what we brought with us from the various communities that we come from, that then started to get molded into, so there's great, despite what most folks think, there's great cultural continuity on the continent of Africa. There is ethnic diversity, but great cultural continuity. And so when we all get here, there are things that we had all kind of done similarly that, and that all there were things that we were all familiar with in essence that might have looked different in form. And so then you start to see those things come together in certain communities. And then what you then started to see was how those, what became those community things, still maintain the essence, but the form was different now. And that form that becomes different now is not based on, the clan, maybe in the African sense, but now it's based on, this actual community that you're in, right? And so, so you're on your way to a service. I know yesterday there was an event in the park to honor Gerald's brother, so the people convened in a park, and I'm sure there was somebody that spoke some comforting words. I'm sure there was some people who were able to say, what Brother Christmas meant to them. And I know there was people that was like, I met him at this very park, and here we are today. I know all of those things happen because that's what we do. And then what else did we do? And what is it that you're likely to see kind of wherever you are in the United States? A balloon release, right? This is one of our cultural expressions of how we manage the loss. And this is a part of how people, process and cope. And so we need ritual in our life, because ritual can be an organizing principle, and it helps to kind of facilitate a level of acceptance, a level of understanding for what is, what has gone on, what's going on, and what's to follow.
Yeah, that is awesome. What's the fifth one, Doc?
Oh, the fifth one was acceptance.
Acceptance.
Yeah. No, I was just saying on the way I conceive of it, I moved it first. And so the fifth one is acceptance.
Okay.
Yeah. So denial,
okay,
anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance.
Depression, and then acceptance. Wow. Yeah. Wow. And in no particular order. But those are the stages. Doc, that is a phenomenal analysis. And thank you for that therapy this morning. Because that's just brilliant. And we certainly appreciate that. I know that we wanted to dovetail this into the Memorial Day celebration. But go right ahead, Doc. Tie that knot up, and we're going to get off the clock with you.
Yes. So one of the things that we have to know, one of the earliest community organizations that free and enslaved Africans established were benevolent societies or mutual aid societies. And I think the first known of record was like 1780 in Rhode Island, and then that followed by Richard Allen and Epsilon Jones in Philly in 1787 with the Free African Society. But the purpose of these organizations was, first and foremost, community support, mutual community support. People would put money together so they would help each other, find a measure of financial, stability, so very collective and cooperative engagement. That pool of money was to help people financially in a business sense. And that money was also to help people who, sometimes and oftentimes couldn't necessarily help themselves. And that was also necessary to ensure that people had a right burial. And so this was one of those things that may have varied in form, but was very consistent in essence wherever African people are. So you had it going on in Rhode Island, you had it going on in Philadelphia, and you also had it going on in Charleston, South Carolina. And that's the dovetail. So Charleston, South Carolina had over, they some astronomical number of mutual aid societies historically, and even during the time of the Civil War. And what these societies do in the space of the burial is that they make sure that there's a right burial, that every departed soul has to have a right burial. So what has been deemed the first Memorial Day, I argue that date could have been anything, because they weren't doing anything different in that May of 1865 than what they did anytime anybody else died. The difference certainly in that day was that you had, I think, some brothers from the 54th, join, as a part of their procession. But the rest of what they did is what they do, is that you have a departed soul. You prepare that departed soul. You have a community recognition of that. You have, in that community recognition, you have somebody speak some words like eulogize. You probably have some people speak memories, right? You have a procession for the interment, right? And then you have a feast. If you read the account on that day, that's exactly what it says happened. That's what happened all the time. That's why that's why people go to New Orleans, so they could see the second line. The procession and things of that nature precede the second line. The second line is and I mean historically, the second line is an addition to that. They were already doing this exact same process in New Orleans. They were doing this exact same process in Rhode Island. They were doing it in Philly. They were doing it wherever Black people were, particularly wherever there were free Black people. So New Orleans is a little different from most of the South. New Orleans and South Carolina, or Charleston, South Carolina, they're a little different than a lot of the other places in the South. First and foremost, because they're major port cities and points of embarkation for enslaved Africans. But in each of those cities, the free African population had a measure of freedom and a freedom of movement that allowed for vestiges of the old country, vestiges for their ethnic identity to be manifest more so than other places, right? And so, my take on things is that all that happened is that some white person took notice of an action that they had never been taken before and wrote it down. This was nothing that started then. This is the purpose of the mutual aid societies. One of the purposes anyway was to bury and maintain those cemeteries, which is why the other thing that we have are Black cemeteries, and we talk about the demolishing and desecration of Black cemeteries, because there were even Black cemeteries to start with, because this is a part of our rich cultural practice, right?
And you hit it right there. High culture And everywhere we've been, no matter what the basis for our travel is, we sprinkle and we leave marks of high culture.
Correct. Correct.
Doc, that is awesome. And I think you have given folks a double blessing today. And that is, there are certainly others that believe that will teach on Memorial Day being more intentionally set out by Black folks. But I mean, there's data to support, your argument, and there's data. I think, there are extractions that can support other folks. But the important thing is, the important thing that you raised was the issue that we fail to even acknowledge is the high culture. Ironically, I was in Philadelphia last weekend, and on Monday went by the AME, the original AME Church, Richard Allen's establishment. He has a monument out there, and it was a very rich experience. They're closed on Monday, so you typically can't. You typically can't. All right, you typically can't go in on Mondays, but man, it was a rich experience just being on those hollow grounds.
And I'm not saying that they weren't recognized. I mean, that event was very much about the fallen, but what they did was go. So it was a mass. There was a mass, an unmarked mass Union graveyard. These people dug up that graveyard and reinterred those soldiers. That's not what's happening when white folks do whatever they do in 1866. It's a whole different thing. These people did what they do. They gave them a right burial. And that right burial had all the essence that would come with a right burial. So you had the circumstance dictated that you have soldiers, because that's who they were buried. But that's a burial that they would provide for anybody. That's why we had mutual aid and burial societies. And Charleston is one of those places that has as great as legacy of burial societies as
I'll
anywhere
catch up with you.
else.
I owe you a call. Okay.
And so, again, it's about the cultural continuity. And so, so my issue with the narrative is that it suggests that started with that event, as opposed to that event is a manifestation of the perpetuation of African culture.
Understood, Doc. That's another hell of an analysis. And man, I think you wrapped it all up for us and put a bow on it neatly for us, man. So that's rich. You certainly appreciate that, man. That's awesome.
Well, thank you, brother, and condolences to the family. And when you go and you memorialize this brother, know again that this ain't just something that we do because people died. This is a ritual process that's intended for the living. That's what the ritual is for. The ritual is for you all. The memorialization is for you all.
Right.
It's a right burial to help you to cope with the departure.
Right. Right.
So go and make sure you take care of yourself and be a comfort to the family, brother.
That's the whole goal, Doc. The whole goal. Well, thank you so much, man. Thank you. And you go ahead and close us out, man.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And again, you'll be able to find us on YouTube as usual at The Level Set. Watch and give us some likes. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we will see you next week.